Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is riot, and this verb was suggested by the viewer Luis. I just want to say a special thank you for this idea. Now let's take a moment and take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might encounter the verb riot can mean to take part in a violent public disturbance. Now, if you happen to live in the United States, what I think is going to come to mind for most people is the January 6th attack on the Capitol. That is an image many people have of a violent public disturbance. Shots were fired. Windows were broken. People were physically attacked. The property was harmed. So all of those good examples of violence in a public fashion. A second way you might hear riot used can mean to behave in an unrestrained way. Now, with the second definition, we're not always describing something being violent, and many times people are using it to really suggest that there's this sort of strong reaction to something. We'll take a look at some examples of this a little later in the video. For now, you should know that riot is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing, and that forms rioting. The past tense and the participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, riot, ends with a T sound. So when I add the ed ending, I'm going to add an extra syllable to this verb. So the past tense and the participle form of our verb should sound like this. Rioted, rioted, right? So that extra syllable makes an id sound. I hope you can hear it as I was saying it. Now, you might encounter one phrasal verb, that's to riot away. This is not a very common one to encounter, but sometimes people will use it to not talk about a public disturbance, but to suggest that someone is spending money in a rather excessive way or maybe in a foolish way. So an example of this, he rioted away his inheritance in less than 2 months. Here the idea, a deceased relative has passed along money or other valuable items, right? And here this person has spent it all in less than 2 months. Again, not super common to hear in many informal speech examples. You might hear somebody blew their inheritance, and again, the idea is they're kind of spending money in a rather foolish, extravagant, or excessive way. Now, let's move on and talk about our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today, we'll practice the simple past tense and the present perfect progressive. Let's start with the simple past tense. We use this verb tense to talk about completed actions that occurred at a known point in the past. Sometimes there will be time signals indicating that known time, but many times you will not see a time signal in every simple past tense sentence. Instead, that's going to be implied as part of a conversation or as part of a longer passage. The nice thing about making sentences in the simple past tense is that our structure stays the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, you're going to see a subject, then you're going to see that ed form of our verb because it's a regular verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. Britons rioted in Southport beginning in July after misinformation spread on social media. Okay, so here, right, we have our known time. We do have a time signal in this particular sentence. So we have a known action. Thankfully, this action is not continuing, right? So again, that's why the writer here might use the simple past tense to talk about this completed action. Now let's take a look at how we make negative simple past tense sentences. To do this, again, we're going to follow the same pattern. No matter what our subject is, we'll have our subject, did not, and then we'll use the base verb. So notice, I'm not using the ed form of the verb here. Let's take a look at another example. A judge ruled the organizer didn't riot in 2019, but he resisted an officer and failed to follow commands. Right? So here we have that negative action. The organizer didn't riot. So this sentence is clearly talking about a legal matter. Right? So it sounds like someone was charged with committing this crime of engaging in a riot. But here, maybe there was not evidence to support that, but there was evidence to convict him of other crimes. Now, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple past tense. To do this, start with did, then you're going to have your subject, and then the base verb. Again, notice I'm not using the ed form of the verb here. Here's another example. Did fans riot after the call went against their team? Now, sometimes when we think about sports, unfortunately, this does happen where there is violence in this public sort of situation. Right? You might be able to think of instances when that has happened. Sometimes that occurs after a team wins a championship here in the United States. Kind of confusing to think about, but it does occur. But sometimes this word will get used to mean more of that second definition. We're talking about kind of behaving in an unrestrained sort of way. So let's move on now to another verb tense. We're going to practice the present perfect progressive. Many teachers and textbooks also refer to this as the present perfect continuous, and that is just fine. It means exactly the same thing. What we're doing in this verb tense is talking about an action that started in the past and is continuing into the present. And usually we're using this verb tense to really stress how long the action has been ongoing. Okay? Now, in the present perfect progressive, I do need to pay attention to my subject. And the whole reason I use present perfect progressive is I want my students to see those 3-letter P's at the beginning of the verb tense and know that they're going to need 3 parts to make their verb. Okay? So, again, pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, you're going to use have, then the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. But if your subject is he, she, or it, use has, been, and the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look. My example sentence here says, citizens have been rioting for the last 5 days. Now, I know many of these videos don't get watched on the first day that they're published, and I was a little hesitant to use a current example because someone might be watching that and thinking, well, that's not ongoing. So I want you to pretend here with my more vague example of something that is ongoing, right? This action, it started in the past, it's continuing, and that does happen where these sort of violent public protests will occur for some period of time. Now, if you want to make a negative present perfect progressive sentence, again, pay attention to your subject. You'll use either have or has, depending on what that subject is, then use not, then been, and then that ing form the verb. Let's look at another example. He hasn't been rioting even though his classmates have been. Right? So here, it's possible this could be referring to that first definition of a violent public disturbance. Probably more likely, we're talking about behaving in an unrestrained way. So that's likely what's being discussed here in that example. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect progressive. To do this, you will start with have or has. Whichever word matches your subject, that subject comes next. Then use the participle been, and then that ing form the verb. Here's my last example. Have they been rioting and destroying property? Right? So again, someone might be asking that question to understand what's been occurring, but that idea that this action is still continuing exists in that example. Now, let's spend a moment talking about some words that are related to our verb riot. And the first word we're going to discuss is just the noun form of this word. You'll notice the noun riot has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation. Like our verb, this noun can have a couple different meanings. One way to use the noun is to refer to a violent disturbance, usually by a crowd. Okay? So an example of this, I kind of used it earlier, but here it is in another sentence. Some people still deny the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021 was a riot. So that article A at the end of the sentence is also a good indication that this is a noun. Generally, what comes after that is going to be a noun. Now, a second way to use it, not so violent, but just to mention an uproar of some kind. So an example of how you might hear this used, you might hear some store, maybe a salesperson say, "These low prices are causing a riot." And again, when someone says something like this, they generally don't mean something violent, but they're suggesting that there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of demand, maybe a lot of excitement for this. And that word does tend to kind of grab people's attention. Now, a third way you might encounter riot isn't really connected to anything we've talked about today, but sometimes it's used to talk about a person or a thing that others find to be highly amusing or entertaining. An example of this, they thought the comedian was a riot, right? It's really like saying they thought he was very funny. They thought he was hilarious. So again, might seem like a funny turn of phrase, but a riot sometimes can be kind of a compliment, again, implying that someone or something is really amusing or very funny. Another related word you might encounter is the noun rioter. So this is going to be a person who's generally a part of a group of people who are meeting in some public place, and they tend to behave in a way that is violent, noisy, and rather uncontrolled or unrestrained. An example of this in a sentence might be, rioters have been arrested and they are facing a hearing later this week. Right? So here we're talking about a group of people. One last word for us to discuss today, it's the adjective riotous. This adjective can have a couple different meanings. So one way to use it is to describe something that's marked by or involving public disorder. So again, think back to that kind of violent definition we continue to revisit here. So an example of this, the riotous crowd could not be contained. And so it's sort of suggesting they were overtaking police or other security. A second way to use this adjective riotous is to describe something that's characterized by wild and uncontrolled behavior. So maybe an example here, you might hear parents say something to their teenage children, "No riotous parties while we are away," right? So we don't want any wild and crazy things happening in our home. Now, a third way to use that adjective goes back to the third definition of our noun. So it's another way to say something is hilarious or something is funny. An example of that in a sentence. His riotous account of the flight delay had everyone laughing so hard they were crying. Okay? So here, someone is telling a story and it is extremely amusing to the point where everyone is laughing so hard they are beginning to cry. Thanks again to Luis for suggesting today's video. I thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.